This video is brought to you by Squarespace. More about them later in the video.
Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, cosmic horror author Eric Malachite, and today we're talking about the German occupation of the Channel Islands, written by Arnaldo Teodrani. If Arnaldo provided links for you to follow, they'll be right alongside links to my books, my storytelling, deep dive, and podcast channel, Story Rant, and more. With that said, let's go ahead and jump into this. This is one of the biggest what-ifs of alternate history. What would have happened if the Third Reich had succeeded in invading Great Britain during the early stages of World War II? In reality, Germany lacked the air superiority and naval strength to pull such an operation, so British territory was never occupied by Axis forces. Well, not quite. When we think of the British Isles, we tend to forget the smaller islands surrounding the coast of Albion, a small archipelago lying in the English Channel, closer to France than to Britain, was successfully invaded by the Wehrmacht on June 30th, 1940. Those islands would remain under occupation until the very end of the war, the only British non-colonial territory to be successfully invaded by Germany. This is the story of a courageous resistance, daring raids, and stubborn defiance, but also betrayal and collaborationism and even mutual respect between the occupiers and the occupied. This is the story of the Nazi occupation of the Channel Islands. The Channel Islands are British Crown dependencies in the English Channel, just off the coast of Normandy, France. The archipelago is subdivided into bailiwicks, governed by two bailiffs: Jersey, with its capital St. Helier, and Guernsey, its capital being St. Peter Port. The bailiff of Guernsey also oversees the islands of Alderney, Serre, Herm, as well as other smaller islands. Considering their geographic location, one may wonder, well, why are they not French? As of the 11th century, the Channel Islands were in fact part of the Dukedom of Normandy. But in 1066, William of Normandy became William the Conqueror and snatched Anglo-Saxon Britain off King Harold's hands. Jersey and friends became part of his new, bigger domain. For centuries, the islands were untouched by war. That is, until some pesky rebels in North America decided to sever their 13 colonies from the Crown. France intervened in support of American independence, staging two amphibious assaults on Jersey, first in May 1779 and later in January 1781. Both attacks failed, first due to inclement weather and later due to the determined resistance of the local garrison. When France became a threat again during the Napoleonic War, the British military protected their coastlines, including those of the Channel Islands, by erecting Martello Towers. 35 of these fortifications sprung up around Jersey and Guernsey, functioning as lookouts and artillery emplacements. The inhabitants of the bailiwicks enjoyed quiet days and nights until the onset of World War II. Adolf Hitler set his eyes on the Channel Islands as early as July 1938, when one German agent was sent there to scope out the defenses. Already envisioning a war against London, the Wehrmacht High Command, or OKW, thought that they could be used by the Brits to stage attacks on mainland Europe, and therefore the islands should be seized. By September 1939, when hostilities started, the Channel Islands were home to some 92,000 inhabitants, among whom an Insular Defense Corps was recruited. Nonetheless, following the invasion and fall of France in June 1940, the British government decided to demilitarize the islands, despite the reluctance of Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Their strategic importance was deemed to be null, and thus by June 21st, the Insular Defense Corps was relocated to mainland Britain. As for the civilians, each island took a different approach to evacuation. Alderney was almost entirely vacated, unlike Serre, where the local authority in charge, Dame Sybil Mary Hathaway, encouraged everyone to stay put. In Guernsey, school children were evacuated, while in Jersey, most inhabitants opted to stay. In total, some 24,000 islanders sailed to Britain. Such options were not offered to local pets and farm animals. More than 5,000 cats and dogs were killed in Jersey. while in the almost empty Alderney, cattle and pigs were simply abandoned. On June 28th, the Germans initiated their attack, as a Luftwaffe squadron bombed a convoy of military vehicles in Guernsey, or so they thought. It was, in fact, a column of lorries transporting tomatoes. As almost 200 bombs fell upon them, 44 farmers and lorry drivers lost their lives. An eyewitness described how the blood of the wounded and dying mingled with the juice of the tomatoes. Following the incident on June 30th, London communicated to Berlin that the Channel Islands had been demilitarized. That very evening, the OKW initiated Operation Green Arrows, a combined arms invasion of the Bailwuchs. The first wave of the invasion consisted of a mere platoon of Luftwaffe troops, who landed in Guernsey. They were very civilly met by Police Inspector Sculfer, who escorted them to the Royal Hotel in St. Peter Port for a meeting with senior officials. On July 1st, authorities in Jersey picked up one of the many leaflets dropped by German planes, intimating immediate surrender. Following advice from London, they complied immediately. 3 waves of German troops arrived by plane or boat, totaling 11,500 men, who quickly distributed a set of rules for the population. Among other directives, the Germans notified locals that we will respect the population of Jersey, but should anyone attempt to cause the least trouble, serious measures will be taken. Troops also instituted a strict curfew, confiscated all weapons, including air guns, and ordered that all spirits must be locked up immediately and no spirits may be supplied, obtained, or consumed henceforth. They clearly knew that an armed, drunken Briton made for a dangerous combination. On July 2nd, Alderney was taken, and on the 3rd, Major Lands took charge of Serre, accompanied by his interpreter, Dr. Moss. There they met Dom Sybil Hathaway and were immediately impressed by her. Moss noted, "You do not appear to be the least afraid." To which Dom Sybil replied, "Is there any reason why I should be afraid of German officers?" We can think of many reasons why, but clearly she was not impressed. Serre was formally occupied on July 4th. Dom Sybil's American husband commented, "A hell of a day on which to be occupied." Tactically speaking, Operation Green Arrows had been less complex than navigating arrivals at Heathrow. Strategically speaking, its importance was questionable, but it had enormous propaganda value. The OKW quickly circulated photos of German soldiers speaking to bobbies on the beat, or marching against a typical quaint British background. These images spelled a clear message: mainland Britain would be next. It wouldn't, but the occupying troops liked to believe so, and for the time being, they greatly enjoyed their time on the Channel Islands. The locals were not outwardly hostile, the weather was pleasant, and the shops well stocked. Jersey, Guernsey, and company could have made for the most uneventful theater of World War II, but as we shall learn, both the Islanders and British Commando units had other plans.
Have you ever wanted to build your own website but can never find the time to learn to code or deal with one of those messy content management systems? Well, Squarespace might be just what you're looking for. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform perfect for entrepreneurs, whether you're an artist looking to sell pop art renditions of World War II era planes and tanks, an author looking to get your library and name out there, or you just want to show the world how much you love history and World War II. Squarespace's next-gen website engine, the Fluid Engine, will make it a cinch to make it a reality. With it, you'll be able to choose from a template and customize it to your heart's content. And best of all, your website will be fully functional on desktop and mobile from the get-go. Did you know that Squarespace has SEO and AI tools now? With Squarespace's guided design system, Squarespace Blueprint, your website will be fully tailored to your brand or business, and you'll be able to make sure your website hits all those SEO sweet spots, ensuring you reach the right people to grow your audience the way you want. With flexible payments, you can make checkout easier than ever before with simple but powerful payment options. Your customers will be able to use credit cards, PayPal, Apple Pay, and in eligible countries, they'll even be able to buy now and pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. And with Squarespace's powerful analytics tools, you'll be able to track your traffic sources, understand how your reach is growing, track sales metrics, and you'll even learn where to focus new engagement to ensure you'll never fall behind the competition. All the data you need to scale your brand or business is at your fingertips, fully integrated and clearly displayed. Ready to get started? Check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographics and use promo code Geographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain.
The OKW in Berlin did not feel the need to crush the locals, opting instead for making a good impression on the islanders. Thus, they appointed as commander-in-chief for the occupation forces Major General Rudolf von Schmetov, an aristocratic officer with good planning skills and impeccable manners. Alexander Kutanch, bailiff of Jersey, later described von Schmetov as a charming and humane officer who favored civilians whenever he could. The commander brought along a cast of blue-blooded sidekicks, including Prince von Waldeck and Graf or Count von Ofsis, who handled communications with Jersey authorities. Crucially, none of these officers had sympathies for the Nazi ideology. Nonetheless, von Schmetov had no appetite for having his soldiers' throats slit in their sleep, and so in June 1941, he imported some 440 members of the GFP, the secret military police, in charge of counter-sabotage, counter-propaganda, and detection of resistance activities. The GFP expected an atmosphere of stiff upper lips and cold shoulders, but were surprised by how many locals were eager to inform on each other. Cases of collaborationism and denunciation were infrequent, but not uncommon. For example, one guy known only as Paddy spied on his friend Charles Michon, who in May 1942 had started printing an underground resistance paper in Guernsey. This publication bore the fantastic name of Guns, Guernsey Underground News Service. Paddy handed over copies of Guns directly to the GFP and later contributed to the arrest and deportation of Michon and his associates. The publisher and one of his friends died while in captivity in Germany. Many young women in both bailiwicks were despised for consorting with the young and handsome German soldiers. Their beaux presented these women with fashionable handbags from occupied France, earning them the moniker of jerry bags. It appears that some 900 babies were born from these relationships, which were not only sexual in nature. After the war, many German men returned to the Channel Islands to marry their wartime dates. Unfortunately, many of these women suffered ostracism and even angry crowds after VE Day. Besides these cases, the majority of interactions between German troops and locals were based on the principle of live and let live. Von Schmetov and the bailiffs found a way to cooperate civilly, and many men found employment working for the occupation forces. And then there were many who resisted. Mainly passively, though, as the unheard of ratio of 1 soldier to 3 civilians prevented any organized active resistance. One way in which islanders manifested their dissent was to own a radio, an offense punishable with imprisonment or even death. But the lure of the BBC was too strong, and many families hid their wireless sets under floorboards or in the bottom of armchairs. Those who did not own a radio found ways to build one from scratch, including by raiding phone booths for parts. Occupiers strictly controlled all forms of news and entertainment, including cinemas. These would typically bill comedies, followed by German newsreels. As soon as they came on screen, groups of islanders loudly booed at the propaganda footage. When the GFP moved in for the arrest, the hecklers made a quick run for it, exiting the cinema via the toilet's windows. The only orchestrated form of resistance was the V sign campaign, where V stood for victory. Islanders painted, engraved, stitched, or embroidered the V sign wherever and whenever they could, as a means to unnerve and demoralize the occupiers. Creatively, laborers took to hammering following a repeating pattern: 3 dots, 1 dash, the Morse code for the letter V. As harmless as it may sound, the Germans hated this barrage of consonants. If one were to be caught painting or hammering a V, they could be fined the equivalent of £1,000 in today's value, or even imprisoned. Among other punishable offenses, simply uttering the word Heil Churchill, which earned one Mrs. Green 4 months in jail, or distributing anti-German flyers, an offense which landed 2 artists in prison waiting for a death sentence, which luckily never carried out. The prize for ingenuity, however, goes to 3 retired Army majors: Crawford Morrison, Manley, and Amy. The trio painstakingly drew maps of German military facilities and fortifications on the island, and then asked a projectionist in St. Helier, Jersey to film them. Crawford Morrison would be deported to Germany in 1942, but he smuggled the films with him and was able to send them to British intelligence. Another notorious act of resistance was the one carried out by the police officers in Guernsey. Constables Bailey and Tuck, worried about lack of food among civilians, took to raiding the troops' supply stores, stealing tins and cans and distributing them to the locals. Other policemen followed their example, but in early 1942 they were found out and arrested by the Germans. These heroic, compassionate constables were tried both by a German military court and Guernsey's royal court, receiving a sentence of 4.5 years of hard labor. According to historian Paul Sanders, the British civilian court in 1942 acted like a kangaroo court in the worst dictatorship. 16 policemen were deported to forced labor camps on mainland Europe. One of them, Constable Herbert Smith, died in captivity. The others returned home at the end of the war, traumatized by beatings, torture, mistreatment, and starvation. What was worse, their wartime criminal convictions were not expunged. Thus, the Guernsey constables were not readmitted in the police force and were denied a pension. Now, we have been mentioning deportation quite a lot. This measure was not part of von Schmettov's initial plans, but he was overruled by Hitler himself. Deportation orders were issued as a retaliation against the internment of 500 Germans carried out by the British in Persia, now Iran. The Führer ordered that for every German held by the British, von Schmettov had to deport 10 islanders. Eventually, in September 1941, the commander deported a total of 2,020 civilians from Jersey, Guernsey, and Serre. The majority of them were interred at the Biberach camp in the Bavarian Alps. Here they enjoyed relatively good conditions, but 46 died of disease nonetheless. After the deportation order, Hitler continued to take interest in the Channel Islands. On October 10, 1941, he issued a directive for them to be converted into impregnable fortresses. As such, they would be incorporated into the Atlantic Wall, the system of fortifications and artillery batteries stretching from southern France to Norway. Starting from November, 16,000 workers from the organization Tot, a state-owned construction company, flocked to the islands, many of them forced laborers. By April 1944, they had built almost 800 defensive structures, erected 15 miles of anti-tank walls, and laid down almost 130,000 landmines. These defenses were integrated with 16 coastal artillery batteries and dozens of anti-aircraft positions. The forced laborers were housed in 3 camps on the island of Alderney, inaugurated in January 1942. A 4th facility named Sylt was soon added to serve as a concentration camp detaining political prisoners, homosexuals, Freemasons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Russian POWs, as well as Dutch and German Jews. The 4 camps housed a total population of 6,000 inmates, 400 of which died in Sylt alone. Some of these inmates were able to escape the Alderney camps, making it to Jersey or Guernsey. Civilians came to the rescue, such as physiotherapist Albert Bedane, who hid Erica Richardson, a Dutch Jew, in his home until the end of the war. Bedane also gave shelter to escaped POWs and Russian slave laborers. Another medical professional, Dr. Noel McKinstry, helped Soviet prisoners, teaching them English and providing them with fake IDs. Louisa Gold, who had lost a son in the war, sheltered yet another Soviet escapee as an act of kindness for another mother's son. Louisa was betrayed by a neighbor and deported to Europe alongside her brother. She would later be gassed at the Ravensbrück concentration camp. By late 1941, life under German rule had become increasingly harsh for civilians. An order issued by military authorities in August threatened the death sentence for those hiding or sheltering of members of enemy forces, for instance, crews of landing aircraft, parachutists, etc. The presence of enemy forces had become a constant worry for von Schmettov and his troops. In fact, as early as July 2, 1940, Winston Churchill had ordered the planning of daring commando raids on the Channel Islands. The first raid, codenamed Ambassador, took place on July 14th and 15th, 1940. Interestingly, the operation was co-planned by celebrity actor David Niven. The plan was for 140 commandos to land on Guernsey, destroy the airfield, and capture or kill as many Germans as possible. But faulty navigation equipment got in the way, and in the end only 40 men reached the intended objective at about 2 a.m. Problem was, it was too late. The raiders were supposed to be exfiltrated by a Royal Navy vessel at 3 a.m., and thus had little time to actually make contact with any Germans. They ran into an enemy barracks, but it was completely empty. After cutting some telephone lines as an act of sabotage, they grumpily returned home, having accomplished nothing. Next came Operation Dryad on September 3rd, 1942. 12 men attacked the Casket Lighthouse, standing on an islet 5 miles west of Alderney. The small German garrison was taken completely by surprise, with some comical effects. One soldier fainted, another one was captured in bed while sleeping with his hairnet on. Classy. The mission was a success. The raiders captured a meager 7 enemies, but filled their pockets with valuable codebooks, which could contribute to cracking the Enigma encryption system. The next raid would have momentous consequences. Operation Basalt was led by Captain Geoffrey Appleyard at the head of 11 commandos. They landed on Serre on the night of October 3rd, 1942, and made their way inland. They reached an isolated house where the lone occupant, Mrs. Pittard, informed them that about 20 Germans were staying at the nearby Dixcart Hotel. Appleyard and his men broke into the hotel and quickly snatched 5 enemy troops from their beds. As they were being restrained, they made a run for it, and a fight ensued. 2 Germans got away, but 2 were killed. Before the runaways could sound the alarm, Appleyard and the raiders returned to the beach and sailed back to mainland Britain, carrying 1 single prisoner. News of the raid reached Hitler, who was infuriated. According to some reports, the killed Germans had their hands tied with cord, a violation of the Geneva Convention. Considering what they did to people in concentration camps, that's rich. In response, he issued the infamous Commando Order of October 18, 1942, which authorized German officers to execute captured Special Forces soldiers. Moreover, the population of Serre bore the brunt of the German reaction. The GFP secret military police questioned and harassed civilians for weeks. Restrictions on curfew and fishing were tightened, and poor Mrs. Pittard was arrested and later deported in February 1943. Commandos returned to Serre on December 29th through 30th, 1943, a small raid known as Operation Hardtack 7. The 5-man Anglo-French team arrived undetected, but soon ran afoul of some of the thousands of mines laid down by the Germans after Operation Basalt. 2 French commandos died in the explosions, prompting the survivors to abort the mission. Throughout 1942 and 1943, in addition to commando raids, the RAF performed successful bombing expeditions on the Channel Islands, targeting Luftwaffe airfields and port installations. In 1944, the air raids intensified in preparation for Operation Overlord, the Normandy landings. Following the success of D-Day, July 6, 1944, the morale of the islanders skyrocketed. The Germans, not so much. As the Allies liberated France, the occupiers realized that they were now completely isolated, cut off from their supplies, which had been, until then, ferried from the Norman port of Granville. A Canadian intelligence officer, Major Alan Chambers, devised a plan to pressure von Schmettow into surrendering the Channel Islands without a fight. Throughout August and September, he had newspapers and leaflets airdropped over the islands as a means to demoralize the garrison. Next, he dropped letters addressed directly to von Schmettow, inviting him for talks to be mediated by a captured German general. Albeit not a Nazi, the island commander was a career general nonetheless and refused to surrender. More precisely, he completely ghosted Chambers. His subordinate officers stood by his decision, even if hunger and isolation were taking their toll. Starvation was even worse among civilians, and London was not indifferent to their plight. After negotiations with the German government, Berlin authorized a Red Cross ship, SS Vega, to resupply Jersey and Guernsey over 5 voyages, from December 1944 to April 1945. SS Vega uploaded a precious cargo of almost 120,000 food parcels to be delivered to civilians only. Naturally, the emaciated troops initiated a lively trade, and many locals traded their humble parcels for German-made wristwatches and binoculars. In early 1945, the garrison started behaving erratically. Some disenchanted soldiers started circulating pamphlets bearing anti-Nazi propaganda, while others dialed up their fanaticism, painting swastikas all over Jersey. Apparently, this move was intended to provoke and anger the civilians, which reacted with typical British humor, hanging empty picture frames around the hooked crosses. Amidst the chaos, von Schmidt-Off decided it was time to boost the morale of his troops by planning a raid against the port of Granville. At the end of February 1945, however, the aristocratic officer was replaced as Channel Islands commander by one of his deputies, Vice Admiral Friedrich Hofmeier, a fanatical Nazi. Von Schmidt-Off was recalled to Germany, ostensibly for health reasons, more probably for political ones, and Hofmeier took over his brainchild, Operation Granville, the last amphibious raid carried out by German forces in World War II. On the evening of March 8, 1945, some 200 troops left St. Helier aboard 13 vessels. The Germans had intercepted the identification signals to enter Granville Harbor, and thus arrived undisturbed, immediately wreaking havoc. Port installations were set on fire while 4 freighters were mined and heavily damaged. An American vessel raised the alarm and attempted to intercept the attackers, but was quickly sunk, losing 14 sailors. Teams of raiders disembarked and attacked a nearby hotel, killing 8 American and British servicemen and capturing 45 more. They then proceeded to free 67 German POWs and even managed to capture a small freighter, taking back to Jersey a precious cargo of coal. Vice Admiral Hofmeier was beaming at the success of this last raid, so much so that he immediately started planning a second attack on Granville. The date chosen for the operation was May 7th, but then Adolf Hitler had already committed suicide, designating Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor. The last Führer of the Third Reich ordered Hofmeier to abort all operations. Earlier that day, Army Chief of Staff General Jodl had signed Germany's unconditional surrender to the Allies. On the morning of May 8th, 2 Royal Navy destroyers approached Jersey, instructing Hofmeier to lay down arms. The fanatical Vice Admiral considered continuing the fight, but his staff pressured him into surrendering. At 3 p.m., Churchill announced on the radio, "Our dear Channel Islands will be freed today." Clearly, the civilians were jubilant, but it seems that the occupiers were even more joyous. When the Royal Navy returned on May 12th to take Hofmeier and other officials into custody, the commander instructed his men to greet the British with a Nazi salute. Apparently and hilariously, by then, his men were too drunk to obey orders. This concludes our story of how a tiny portion of British territory was invaded by Axis forces, providing a glimpse of how a full-scale occupation of Britain might have played out. Obviously, the history of the Channel Islands is far richer and more complex, and their natural and cultural landmarks are well worth a visit. But if you found our tale interesting and would like to know more, check out The Last Raid, the Commandos, Channel Islands, and Final Nazi Raid by Will Fowler, as well as the links in the description below. Be sure to do all that algorithmic jazz, check out my links in the pinned comment, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.